Okay. Well, thanks very much. And thanks for taking the time to tune in here and join a discussion about what we know and think we know about bats offshore. This is a topic that's been a primary focus of mine at work and also in graduate school over the past going on 7, 8 years. And it's one that continues to be of interest to, pretty wide variety of people. Um, I would say 15 years ago, there would have been very, very little, almost no information known about this topic. And so this is something that we have really only recently learned much about. And there's still an awful lot that we don't know. And so what I always leave, hopefully, quite a bit of room here at the end for questions. So as I'm going along, keep track of things you might be interested in, and I'll try to do a little bit of, scratch the surface of a number of different topics, and then hopefully pique your interest, and we can circle back and take a deeper dive into anything that you might be curious about. So the context here that we're working in is the coast of Maine is one of it's a beautiful landscape. It's highly interesting from an ecological point of view and interesting also for getting around in general. But the islands off of Maine's coast are really treasures of history and interesting biodiversity. And the Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge is as I'm sure many of you know, is a complex of I think the number is 49 remote islands and 4 coastal properties up and down the coast that collectively support a wide range of unique and important habitat for wildlife. So seabirds are no doubt the best known and most visible wildlife on Maine's coastal islands. But our focus this evening is on something subtler, but no less fascinating. And that, of course, is bats. So bats are the only group of mammal on the planet that's capable of powered flight. Flying squirrels can glide, but only bats can fly. And they're also among the most diverse group of mammals, occupying a pretty phenomenally wide, diverse of ecological niches. And they're enormously important also in terms of economic, what we call ecological services that they provide to people. And this mostly comes in the form of control of agricultural pests. A study in Science magazine a few years back estimated that bats in the north, bats provide an economic benefit to North American agriculture in the neighborhood of $3.7 billion. So it's a pretty huge chunk, and it's something that many people have no idea that's going on. One thing that I find is that bats sort of get lumped into one category in a lot of people's mind, and there's reasons for this. It's easy to see birds and know that some are big, some are small. Some uh, are uh, are carnivorous, some eat other birds, eat small mammals. There's hawks, there's seabirds, there's ducks, there's songbirds. They're very obviously different and diverse. Bats, on the other hand, are nocturnal. We can't see them, we can't hear them. For the most part, they're invisible to us. And for that reason, they kind of get lumped into one category. And it's important to always keep in mind that bats, in fact, are highly variable and highly diverse. And what one bat does may be very unrelated to what another type of bat does. And that's important to keep in mind as we think about bats in any context, but especially the context that I mostly work in, which is what bats are doing offshore. And ultimately, the reason for all of this is a lot of this work that I've been doing is to think about the potential impacts to bats from various things, and namely wind energy. So bats, generally speaking, despite the fact that they're very interesting, they're fascinating from an ecological perspective, they've not fared well in most cultural mythology, and especially that in the Western tradition. Perhaps because they're nocturnal, they're a little bit mysterious, they're kind of an between birds and mammals. It's hard to know where to put them. And you have stories like Dracula, and more recently, the truth that bats often are the carriers of some pretty nasty diseases, and they have some interesting aspects to their immune system that allows them to be carriers of things like rabies. Um, for a lot of these reasons, bats haven't been nearly as popular as birds. And partly for this reason, they haven't received the degree of ecological and scientific study that many other species have. So the past about 10 years or so, maybe 15 years ago, um, that's really changed a lot. And there's now an awful lot more research going on about bats. And two factors are really responsible for this sudden interest in bats in terms of scientific research and also conservation efforts. And those are together are white nose syndrome, shown on the left, and wind energy and impacts on bats. So this is where some of the distinctions between different types of bats come into play, and I'll go into this in more detail. But briefly, if you haven't heard of it, white nose syndrome is a novel fungus that first appeared in around New York State in 2006 and enters caves of cave hibernating bats and essentially irritates them to the point that they wake up more often than they can in the winter, more often than they have energy to, and they deplete their fat reserves and end up dying in the spring in large numbers. And it's estimated that this fungus has wiped out over 90% of some species in the Northeast, some of species that were formerly among the most common species on the landscape. So white nose syndrome is a unprecedented game changer in terms of bat conservation throughout North America, but particularly in the Northeast. And it affects the suite of species that hibernate in caves. Wind energy, on the other hand, was thought primarily, I think it's safe to say it, before too many studies went into it, that it would primarily be an issue for birds. And during the first few studies that were attempting to quantify fatality rates of songbirds and hawks and the like, people found a surprising number of bat carcasses, which I think was a surprise to most people because bats are famously good at avoiding obstacles in complete darkness, and they're able to chase tiny insects on the wing. They're highly maneuverable flyers. But time and time again, studies at commercial wind farms have found pretty high fatality rates. And this has caused a lot of research into quantifying how much fatality is occurring. And it's now thought that upwards of 500,000 bats annually may be killed at commercial wind energy throughout North America. And as the industry expands and as it expands into offshore area, it becomes that much more important to understand what's driving these fatality patterns and ultimately what can be done to reduce that risk. So, again, as the industry, right now, wind energy in North America is confined primarily to terrestrial landscapes, to high elevation, windy places on land. But there's a tremendous interest now in offshore expansion, recognizing the phenomenal wind resource that exists offshore and the ability to actually put wind energy closer to the places that are using power. The New York City sort of eastern seaboard is basically out of room to put a land-based power generation and even transmission. So the offshore option is very appealing to the industry and probably a pretty important part of a renewable energy future. But with an expansion like this, it's essential to figure out as much as we can about what constructing these massive things in the offshore habitat might do to things like bats. So that's sort of the context of the reason behind a lot of the work that I've been doing that I'll be focusing on tonight. And hopefully I'll be able to give you an overview not only of the biology of bats and sort of their diversity, but we'll take a dive back into the history of what was known about bats offshore before all of these recent studies took place, and then end up with a bit more of a discussion about how we can apply this information that we've learned to not only just our understanding about bats, but doing what we can to minimize potential conflicts between bats and offshore wind, in focusing on the Gulf of Maine, but really, I think the results can be applied in a much broader context. So again, starting here in Maine, there's 8 species of bats that occur in this state. I don't have the exact number in North America, but again, bats are among the most diverse group of mammals. And so most bats in North America share essentially the same shape, the same overall kind of body plan. These are just line drawings to illustrate relative scale. They're not all quite this similar. But essentially a bat is basically a large airfoil. If you hold your hands out and you stick your thumbs up in the air, you can see your fingers sort of are making a very tiny wing, if you will. And what you can see on these drawings here, the thumb is really at the top of the wing. It's very short. And then the wing itself is supported by the remaining finger bones. There's a couple fused here that you can't see very close together. So they basically share the same anatomy that most mammals do. I believe there's a certain gene that's inhibited when they're that would ordinarily prevent finger growth in something like a mouse, for example, that led to the evolution of a wing in bats. But essentially, it's a very large, flying and highly maneuverable, highly shapeable wing that a bat is. And most bats in Maine, all bats in Maine are insectivorous, so they eat a variety of insects, mosquitoes, beetles, moths, and all of them use echolocation to not only navigate, avoid obstacles during flight, but capture prey. And interestingly enough, echolocation was something that was really not understood to science until the middle of the 20th century. But it's this very fact that the bats echolocate that allows us to monitor them over long periods of time using special detectors that can hear the ultrasonic signals that they emit. So when you look up close, these are X-rays of the wing of a bat showing their forearm bones, and you can see here clearly the finger bones that make up the wing, and you can also see blood vessels running through the wing. So unlike a bird, which has sort of feathers, obviously, that are not living tissue anymore, the actual wing membrane of a bat is skin, and it can be healed. And importantly for bat flight, it's a great way of it's like a radiator. So it allows them to maintain, to keep their body temperature in check as they fly. So they're perfectly well adapted to flight and long flight. And I think that's something that initially people have perhaps assumed that bats aren't maybe as good at flying as birds are. But in fact, we found through work out in the Southwest where Brazilian free-tailed bats live, you can actually see them flying in X-rad radar imagery. They're capable of enormous distance flight and highly efficient flying. Unlike most birds, they can eat while they're flying, consuming insects. So they're very good at covering large distances. And so perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise that bats end up in some pretty far-flung places, including remote islands. So as I mentioned, echolocation is what allows most North American bats to fly around in complete darkness and capture prey. And it's these ultrasonic frequencies that are above the range of human hearing that are highly reflective and will bounce off of their insect prey and other bats and virtually anything else around and give them a tremendous amount of information on their surroundings. That I think we only, at this point, we've only scratched the surface of how echolocation works and the degree to which a bat can use this sense to not only communicate with other bats, but understand a vast amount of their surroundings. And this is part of the reason it's so surprising in some ways that collision fatality of bats at wind turbines is a problem at all. But when you think about the scale of a bat and how quickly and how large a wind turbine, how large a wind turbine is and how quickly the blades are moving, it's more a factor that they can't get out of the way in time. So for the same reason that bats can occasionally be subject to roadkill from cars, it's thought that the fast motion of the turbine blades is what makes them unable to avoid them. But fortunately for us, echolocation is one of the few tools that, the few habits of a bat that allows us to actually monitor them. At this point, you can really only record them or use pretty specialized camera equipment that can see the thermal imaging camera. So it sees heat instead of light, allowing you to visualize bats at night. But again, that technology has only been available in the last few years, and it tends to be more difficult to monitor. And it also doesn't necessarily tell you what type of bat you're looking at. So again, echolocation wasn't known before the mid-50s. It was discovered by a man named Donald Griffin while an undergraduate at Harvard. And there's a pretty fascinating story of ultimately how he discovered echolocation. But as far back as several hundred years before Donald Griffin, people sort of understood that bats were somehow able to avoid obstacles and fly in the dark, and they knew it was something beyond their eyesight. But it was conventional wisdom that some sense of touch, of ability to measure airflow or detect proximity to other objects using their fur that allowed them to avoid obstacles. And it really wasn't until Donald Griffin uncovered some of the early notes of people that were making observations of bats that knew that they could still avoid obstacles without vision, but that if you plugged their ears, they no longer could avoid obstacles. So there was some thought that hearing was involved, and by putting bats in a room with a special piece of equipment that could measure ultrasound, they immediately could hear that there was this tremendous world of sound that was simply out of the range of human hearing. So now, 50 years after his discovery, there's a wide array of detectors that you can buy that allow you to not only hear these sounds, but record them for long periods of time and run them through software programs that can tell you with a relatively good accuracy what types of bats you're listening to. And there's even an iPhone app at this point that will allow you to see in real time which bats are flying around. And it's kind of a game changer in terms of making bat watching something that one could do recreationally. And this is something I think it's people in Europe have been doing this a lot longer than in North America. But all of these detectors shown here are basically products of the past decade or so of development. And if you are interested in more about echolocation, I highly recommend tracking down a book called Listening in the Dark. You can probably find it in libraries. It's out of print now, but it's a fascinating book that delves very deep into the physiology and the behavior of bat echolocation. So what these detectors do is they essentially generate they turn the sound into a picture that we can look at. So this sonogram on the right is a picture of what the chirps of an eastern red bat, shown here on the left, look like. And you could press the time scale a little bit to be able to look at them. But this, if you can read the numbers, this is at about 35 to 60 kilohertz. So human hearing tops out a very, very high pitched sound would be in the neighborhood of 14, 16 kilohertz. And above that, most people can't hear anything. So these sounds are completely inaudible to people, but they're actually quite loud and they're relatively easy to record to generate high quality recordings with these acoustic bat detectors. So a lot of our work involved essentially putting bat detectors out for long periods of time on islands, on lighthouses, to see what we'd hear. Now, the reason we did all this in the first place, I like to include this slide prepared by Steve Pelletier, who I worked with for many years and who insisted and for a long time was very persistent in the assumption that we know that bats do go offshore sometimes. There's historical records of sailors and sea captains seeing bats well offshore that go back several hundred years. And so he continued to raise this question of, well, how often are bats out there? What types of species are there? And what might this mean as things like wind energy also move offshore? And so Steve convinced the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the federal agency that reviews and permits offshore wind, to do a literature review of what's known about bats offshore. And that resulted in some pretty fascinating accounts. And I like, this is perhaps the most interesting, written by Dr. C. Hart Merriam in 1887. He had found, well, I'll just read you what he wrote. So a granite lighthouse stands upon Mount Desert Rock, a lonely, barren dot in the ocean off the coast of Maine, 20 miles south-southeast of Mount Desert Island, 15 miles from the nearest land and 30 miles from the mainland. The rock is so small and bleak that it is not inhabited by bats. Then he goes on to say, still, as I have been informed by the keeper of the lighthouse, Mr. Thomas Milan, a few dark-colored bats visit the place during their migrations every spring and fall. And in order to identify the species, Mr. Milan, at my request, was kind enough to send me several specimens procured on about October 1st, 1885, and they proved to be silver-haired bat. So this, I love this story because you imagine this lighthouse keeper who turned out was the keeper of Mount Desert Rock for, I believe, 20 years, which is perhaps the most remote, well, it is the most remote island off the coast of Maine. But it makes you realize all of the different things he would have seen out there over that time period. But apparently it was somewhat regular to see a few bats out on this island during what was presumably the migratory period. So despite this interesting account, really not much was written about bats offshore until we began our study of almost 125 years later. So we went into this work knowing that bats do occasionally visit these places, but we had no idea how frequent that was and what species might turn up there. I actually just found today, when preparing these slides, another great photo. This is a little brown bat photographed at Machia Seal Island, so just across the border in New Brunswick. Also a quite remote island, quite far from the mainland. And this was taken in June 2006, so before whitenose came. And apparently there was a small colony of, well, I don't know how many bats, but several individuals would be in residence on the island much of the summer. And so this is a pretty fascinating shot he got, where you can kind of see the surf and the rocks in the background. So we went into this study knowing that occasionally bats are here, but are they actually living on the islands? Are they just visiting? Are they passing through? Are they blown there in storms? We don't fully know. So my own personal journey to study bats offshore began with a day trip out to Petite Manane Island in July 2009. And here's a photo from the lighthouse looking back at the mainland. I was able to tag along on a trip by the Fish and Wildlife Service out to deliver supplies to their field team that was out studying birds on the island. And so we tagged along with the goal of putting a bat detector up in this lighthouse on the island. And it was nice to be able to see some puffins and razorbills along the way. So this is, I think, the second tallest lighthouse in Maine at about 80 feet. So it's a pretty good height, and you can see circled there is a little bracket that we attached to the outside of the lighthouse, in which we put an acoustic bat detector. So this one actually had a cell phone modem that would send us daily updates and actually send the data back to us. We weren't sure if this would work or how long this unit would keep going, but it was sort of the first test of this system. Everything was powered by a little battery and a solar panel, and we put this out, crossed our fingers, and went back to the mainland in hopes that the detector would be running throughout the summer and fall. And it ended up that the technology worked pretty well and did exactly what it was supposed to for the most part. And we ended up putting these detectors on many different remote islands and lighthouses. This is the Monhegan Island Lighthouse. And we did this from 2009 and 2011, kind of at a small scale each year. And then in 2012, received funding from the Department of Energy to expand this network of detectors into the mid-Atlantic coast and the Great Lakes. And ultimately, we put out 38 detectors at 38 locations, many of which were in the Gulf of Maine, a few in the mid-Atlantic, and then a few scattered around in the Great Lakes as well, and also on 3 research vessels that were moving around in the mid-Atlantic coast. So collectively, all of these detectors were out for 17,000 nights, or detector nights, in which we recorded about 565,000 bat passes. Now, offshore really excludes land. By definition, it's 3 nautical miles away from land. So an island technically isn't offshore, but our logic in studying bats at islands was that to get there, a bat has to cross a considerable amount of open water. And so by building these data sets of bat activity as a function of season and time of night, it was our hope that we could understand a little bit more about when and possibly why bats might be flying in these areas. So this is a photo of the Mount Desert Rock Lighthouse, the same one that the lighthouse keeper recounted collecting silver-haired bats in the 1880s. And this was the most remote of our sites, and we visited in late summer, I think, well, maybe August 2009, to put out a detector. I didn't get to go on this trip, but you can see up here at the top of the lighthouse is the acoustic detector, and this was kind of our prized destination, in hopes that to get here, again, a bat has to cross about a minimum of 26 miles of open water. And it makes you question a lot of, if a bat ends up here, was it purely by accident? Did it know that this island was there and it was its destination? Unfortunately, we can't really answer those questions, but by collecting information, this was the kind of spot that would be most interesting in monitoring activity. Ultimately, we ended up recording 4 different species of bats here, including silver-haired bats, hoary bats, little brown bats, and eastern red bats. Now, I didn't fully mention this before. Hoary bats, silver-haireds, and eastern reds are somewhat closely related species which share the trait that they are migratory as opposed to hibernating. So unlike the little brown bats and others that congregate in caves and enter hibernation throughout the winter, long-distance migratory bats, sort of like songbirds, fly south in the winter and remain somewhat active. They do enter torpor, and they're not flying around as often in winter. But it's these migratory species that are the primary ones that are susceptible to wind energy fatality, and also the most likely, we assumed, to show up at offshore at remote islands. And in fact, silver-haired bats were among the more common species recorded, but we did record a fair share of little brown bats out at this lighthouse. And keep in mind, a little brown bat is just a few grams, a very small creature, to be making this long distance crossing. I think we were surprised that, in fact, that we detected bats for, between July and October, mid-July and mid-October. At this location, we detected bats for 30 to 40% of nights sampled, which I think is a surprisingly high number. There were certainly long periods of time with no activity, but it wasn't a completely unusual event for there to be a bat flying near the lighthouse. And I should also mention that the echolocation calls of bats, because they're ultrasonic, really don't travel very far. So they're they give a bat a lot of information, but they don't give a bat long range information. So with one of these detectors, you can only record a bat when it's probably no more than 30 meters, or about 90 to 100 feet from the detector. So a pretty small amount of airspace in the grand scheme of things that we're monitoring. So this is another picture taken the following year of the same lighthouse, and it lived up to its reputation for heavy weather. And you'll see actually the bottom of this whole building was washed away by Tropical Storm Bill, which came through in late August, bringing with it 20-foot waves. And our detector was up here and where this circle was, and survived the storm, and actually surprisingly recorded bats most nights in August, including, there were, I think, only 2 or 3 nights at the peak of the storm where we didn't record anything. So ultimately, these data sets lead to almost as many questions as they do answers. For example, are the bats that we record at this island simply passing through on their course? Do they stop? Do they know the island is there? Are they living in the lighthouse perhaps? And by accumulating stories like this from many, many different sites, we've started to piece together a little bit clearer picture of when bats turn up offshore. So just as an example, from this same data set in 2009, we recorded 143 chirps, or bat passes, we call them, so a time when a bat passed by and was recorded, during only 3 hours in the night of September 15th, and no bat activity detected for the previous 5 nights or the subsequent 13 nights. So again, in an island that's this small, if you have a resident bat, it's pretty likely you'll record it at some point over the night. And so what I find fascinating in an account like this is to think about whether is this one wayward bat that ended up there, or is this perhaps a group of bats in the midst of migration, taking the shortcut across the Gulf of Maine, perhaps from Nova Scotia, or just using the offshore habitat the way that songbirds sometimes do during their migratory flight. Now, little brown bats are not long distance migratory bats, but they do move considerable distances between their summer and winter ranges. So it's sort of a fascinating question to, again, think about what these bats might be doing. Now, 87% of silver-haired bat activity, again, this is the bat that was found by the lighthouse keeper, was recorded in a 5-night period at the end of August 2009. So there were different time periods, different species would show up at different times of the year and under different conditions. So it's pretty clear in a situation like this that these are not resident bats, but bats moving through at certain times of year, much more than other times. And the forward summary of our entire study was that bats were everywhere, but not often. So this is a smattering of the places that we put detectors. And we recorded bats at every single site that we monitored, including islands, remote rocks, bridges. This is the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel up here in the middle, offshore buoys, decommissioned oil platform. So the Chesapeake Light Tower, many, many miles off the Virginia Beach coast. And in most cases, we didn't detect bats regularly, or a lot of bats regularly. The big exception being this lighthouse on the lower left here. This is Seguin Island Light, which is constantly illuminated, unlike most lighthouses. So you can think of it almost like a giant bug light. That's my explanation of why we recorded tens of thousands of eastern red bats nearly every night at this lighthouse. But overall, the pattern was that bats did occur at some point at every location, but most of the activity was concentrated during a relatively small number of nights. And if you look at, I've tried to minimize the number of graphs, but generally speaking, the mid-August and early September was the peak of bat activity for eastern red bats, hoary bats, and silver-haireds. To some extent, silver-haired bats also had a little bit of a spring blip, but it's primarily a late summer, early fall phenomenon of bats being offshore based on our acoustic records. And so some of the key findings of this study, again, bats detected at all locations, highly seasonal presence. There was less activity as distance from the mainland increased, and less frequent activity as you just got further from shore. We did detect bats up to 81 miles from shore, and eastern red bats were at 97% of locations, and were almost half of the total number of identified bat passes. Silver-haired and hoary bats were also detected at most surveyed sites, but in lower numbers. And I should always remind people that the number of bat calls is not necessarily the same as the number of bats. A single bat flying repeatedly past the detector is recorded every time, and it's very difficult if not impossible, to tease that out from the actual number of bats. But even the smallest species of bats, including the Myotis, were detected at most sites, including some of the most remote sites. Subsequent to our study, others have compiled additional records of bats offshore, and these patterns largely continue. Most of the bats found are migratory. A lot of them are eastern red bats, and most of the observations do occur in late summer. So shifting gears a little bit, as I mentioned before, there aren't a whole lot of options available for studying bats, especially when you get offshore. But very small radio transmitters known as nanotags are another tool that's available that we used in a small pilot study in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, again hosted on some of the Maine coastal the islands as part of the wildlife refuge. So all of these little yellow dots on this map are what's known as MODIS receivers, and they're antennas that monitor the same frequency. It was designed initially for songbird work, and the advantage of this network is that they're all monitoring the same frequency, but the tags themselves have individual identifiers in the patterns of beeps that the tags make. And so any animal that's tagged that flies within range of these towers is recorded. And what this allows is unprecedented information on large-scale movements of very tiny creatures. So thinking of small songbirds, that because the tags only weigh 1/3 of a gram, they can be put safely on a variety of wildlife that's simply too small for a traditional radio transmitter. So we and then several other researchers through University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and other fish and wildlife refuges have to date tracked about 45 bats along the coast, the northeast coast, with nanotags. And together we've been able to document individual bats moving as far as 800 kilometers along the coast, up to almost 100 kilometers per day, and extensive movement up and down the coast, not necessarily all going in the southwesterly direction, but this is kind of the opposite of the data we get from acoustics, which is we don't know anything about the individuals that we're recording, but we get a lot of different bats recorded. With this sort of data, we get a lot of information on a few individuals that are tagged. And so it's two very different types of information that we're trying to put together to understand bat movement. But it does suggest that bats are migrating along the coast, and presumably there's a relationship with weather as far as when bats are more likely to move long distances. The other thing that tags let you do is track individual bats. And this is a picture, it's a little hard to tell what's going on, but this is a little brown bat. Its head is over here on the left, and that's a bit of seaweed. And it's stuck wedged in a day roost in this little crack in the bedrock right on the shore of Petit Manan Point, which is part of the refuge. You can see the hills of Acadia in the background. And we tracked this bat to this day roost in the evening, and it was literally just a few feet above the high tide mark. And it's interesting because this was in October, I believe, and at this location, it gets very cold at night. There's a lot of fog. There aren't really very many larger trees. There's sort of scrubby birch trees and so forth, but these rocks heat up nicely in the sun during the daytime, and they appear to be a pretty good place for a bat to hang out. Again, presumably not all summer. This would be more of a fall migration season phenomenon. But this was a pretty neat find. To have a little brown bat roosting in a rock in general is unusual, and I think especially to have one roosting so close to the ocean. So, shifting gears and thinking about wind energy and what all of this information, the fact that bats are offshore quite predictably during the fall, what might this mean for wind farms? Some of the data that we collected from buoys, I think, might be most useful. And this is a photo of one of these weather buoys that records wave height and water temperature and wind speeds. We were able to put detectors on 5 of these buoys, Most of them, all of them were destroyed at one point or another, but two buoys in particular gave us really good data sets and operated simultaneously for a complete summer and fall. So again, this is midway up the coast here, and the buoys are about 100 kilometers apart, 10 to 20 kilometers offshore. And at each buoy, we recorded about 300 to 400 bat calls, mostly in August, September, and most of these were red bats. And you can see the blue colors show times at night. So this is the month of August shown, where every hour gets a little cell, and yellow means daylight, blue is at night. So you can see almost all the bats are there at night, which again makes sense in general, but occasionally you have a little bit of bat activity documented before the sun sets. And keeping in mind that to be out here in the first place, the bat had to already fly over about 10 kilometers of open ocean. But again, most of the activity is concentrated during a relatively small number of hours. And when you overlay temperature and wind speed, on this, you can see that most of the large black dots, which indicate a lot of bat activity, are during pretty calm time periods. So I think weather is a strong influencer potentially on when bats might occur offshore, but season is the primary factor. So in thinking about the potential impacts from wind, it's pretty clear that there is potential exposure of bats to turbines, but the critical question is, when are the bats there, and what might the turbine be doing at that point? I think it's encouraging if most of the bat activity is occurring during very calm conditions, because the turbine may or may not even be operating at that point. But the reason the wind industry is expanding offshore is, of course, because it's generally speaking, it's windy out there. And so I think the time will tell whether the bats are actually present at these offshore turbines under the types of conditions that are associated with higher fatality rates at land-based wind projects. Now I'll skip through a couple of these slides, so I want to make sure that there's some time for questions. But again, the patterns, what we know about fatalities of bats at terrestrial wind farms, I think will largely apply in terms of the seasonality, the conditions under which high-risk conditions occur, and the species involved. I think the big question for offshore wind is there enough fatality to be measurable? And I think that will really drive the question of, if anything, what measures can be taken offshore to minimize risk. I think my hunch is that the magnitude of fatality risk will be substantially lower offshore, but that the patterns in terms of species composition and seasonal timing during the fall will be similar. So we think these are the things we think we know, that risk to bats at turbines is a function of exposure to turbine operation. If you turn a turbine off, the risk goes away. And so that this exposure declines with distance from the mainland and is largely determined by the time of year and weather conditions. And ultimately, what we need to know to manage and avoid risk for bats offshore is to what extent bats might be attracted to these large offshore structures, and how many bats are we talking? What are the fatality rates at turbines? And all of this will be somewhat difficult to measure. Fortunately, some of the same tools we used in our previous study would work pretty well on a turbine, including acoustic detectors. And there's a lot of places to attach equipment. This is the bottom of one of the 5 offshore turbines at the Block Island wind farm. And you can see they're very big, and there's a lot of places to put equipment. That being said, it's a pretty hostile environment out there. And ultimately, if we're monitoring a bat down here near the water, which is where all of our records have come from so far, to what extent does that tell us what's happening a couple hundred meters higher in the air? And that's really the open question. We are able to put radio tracking antennas on these turbines as well. And ultimately, we'll have to rely on technologies like cameras to tell us what's really happening up in the rotor swept zone. And there are a couple of large-scale research efforts that will be kicking off here in the next few years, funded by the Department of Energy and others. So I'm optimistic that we'll know considerably more about what the actual behavior of bats around these offshore turbines might be, keeping in mind that what we learn from land-based projects should be quite applicable. So I'll skip ahead. All of these slides will be available, and I can post links to the full report. Most of my information came from our Department of Energy study, and the full report has a huge amount of information about all of the locations that we monitored and the patterns that we saw. And I've got a few more recent publications here that if people want to do some further research. But I wanted to take a quick minute to recognize the many different groups and organizations, including the Fish and Wildlife Service. Largely, they were our rides to most of these sites and provided an enormous amount of logistical help in collecting these data. So with that, I hopefully have some time for questions, and again, appreciate everybody's interest.
So if anyone has any questions at this point, if you want to type them into the chat, we'll feed them to Trevor so he can get you guys some good answers. So we have a question here. Someone wondering what the name of the app is that you mentioned during your presentation.
Oh yes, okay. So, well, there might be more of them available than I'm aware of. The one that I've used is called, oh boy, what is it called? So that it's Echometer. It's made by Wildlife Acoustics is the company. You have to get a little device that plugs into your phone called an Echometer Touch, and that's the name of the app that comes with it. So it takes your phone's microphone won't record a bat. So you need an ultrasonic sensitive microphone. But yeah, Kaleidoscope is the software that they use. There's a number of manufacturers out there that make kind of commercial grade or recreational grade, I guess you call it, devices, but all of them do require some special device that can actually sense the ultrasonic transmissions. So we used Anabat detectors for a lot of these. Wildlife Acoustics is another company. Peterson makes them. So there's quite a few that you can find if you just Google bat detectors.
All right, we have another question here. What monitoring would you recommend for offshore wind facilities currently being permitted?
Well, if I get to pick all of the things I'd like to monitor, I certainly would recommend acoustic bat detectors, partly because they're relatively easy to deploy. I would like them put on the tops of the turbines if possible. On the nacelle is where the rotor connects to the tower. I think it's hard to get permission to put any equipment up there, but I think that would tell us a lot about whether bats are actually active at that height. There's thermal imaging cameras are ultimately the best technology to see what critters, whether they be birds or bats, are flying near the turbines. The specifications of a camera to see something as small as a bat at the distance that you need, it takes a pretty high resolution camera. But I think that's ultimately going to be an important part of the monitoring. Radar can be used to trigger cameras and train them on things, but not something as small as a bat. And I'm still hoping for what people have called sort of the thunk sensor of something that would record collisions and at least tell us the time of when that's happening. But ultimately, cameras, a combination of cameras and acoustics, I think will be the most promising technology of what's out there at the moment. But people are working pretty hard at coming up with tools that will do this.
So we have another one about asking if any deterrence technologies have been tested on any offshore wind farm operations.
Great, and that's something I didn't address at all. There's a lot of work on technologies that would keep bats away from the turbines, or at least warn them about the presence. And most of them are using ultrasonic sound. A couple are using lights, whether ultraviolet or visible light. And there's a lot of work at terrestrial wind farms. I think offshore would be a really tough place to test that technology. But if a deterrent works at a terrestrial turbine, I think it would work. It should work pretty well at an offshore turbine. But there's a lot we don't know about the biology, the behavior of how a deterrent might work. At some point, if something is a deterrent, that there's a limited range over which that might occur, and what's going on at the boundaries of the range. Does it remain a deterrent or not? Is it potentially attracting bats because it might be interesting? There's a lot we don't know. I think fortunately we don't have to prove the technology at offshore sites. We can work out the bugs at a terrestrial landscape and then apply what works best to that offshore context.
Yeah, we have another question asking if you could discuss the roles of bats in supporting our agriculture in Maine as night shift pollinators.
That's not something I know much about. Bats are important pollinators in some situations. In the desert Southwest, there's a lot of flowers that are bat pollinated. I don't know whether there's much known about the role bats do or don't play in Maine as far as pollination. I think it's safe to say they're probably consuming a lot of insects. Whether those are agricultural pests or not is something I don't know. Most of the science study I referenced earlier is mostly talking about free-tailed bats, and I think it's corn webworms is a particular pest of the Southwest. So that's this is a perfect example of the things we don't know about bats. But I don't believe too many in the Northeast. The bats are mostly eating insects, not nectivorous, nectar drinking bats.
Any thoughts about the potential impact of FAA warning lights on the wind turbines and how it may relate to collision risk?
Yep. So this is something most turbines, I think all offshore turbines, have to have flashing lights for aircraft warning. And there's been a lot of work as far as whether those might attract birds in particular. To my knowledge, most of the studies have not found a strong relationship between lit turbines and unlit turbines as far as bat fatality rates. Lighting in general can be a major problem for migratory birds. And it is thought to be the reason behind several large collision events that have occurred at buildings and including some lighthouses. So the less lighting, the better from an ecological perspective in general. But there is a certain amount of lighting required on these. There's technologies like radar triggered lights that only turn on when aircraft are present. I think there's some technical issues to be worked out with those, but generally speaking, it's true that the less light, the better for a wildlife interaction perspective. See, I can see some questions here too. So there's a couple of questions about minimization of what's being done to minimize risk to bats. And we talked a little bit about deterrence. The other thing is called curtailment, is essentially to turn the turbines off at the low wind speeds where most fatalities occur. And there's a lot of work going on. That's most of what I've been doing recently is looking at using the same acoustic data to figure out when it's most useful to turn turbines off. There's no reason that wouldn't work offshore. The trouble with it is it also prevents a turbine from generating power. And so it's a trade-off between the minimizing risk and the sacrificing power generation. And so I think when thinking on a really big picture, weighing the pros and cons of doing that offshore versus terrestrial, I think it's important to think about the overall magnitude fatality happening in each place. And that could help weigh the pros and cons of curtailing turbines offshore versus onshore. It's certainly not a popular measure by the industry, and I think there's room to make it much more efficient. So in other words, to reduce the amount of time turbines are shut off. And that's where I think some of the information we have on the limited season in which bats are active could make some of those strategies, a little bit more palatable if you only have to implement them during the periods of highest risk. To my knowledge, I don't think no offshore wind turbines are required to do this yet. Again, most of the concern with offshore is with birds and marine mammals, other creatures besides bats. But I do think it's something that we need to keep in the forefront. We have the tools, some tools available to measure whether whether there's exposure happening offshore, and I think it's certainly not something the industry is ignoring. There's a lot of interest, and there's a lot of research going on to try to figure out how best to minimize risk. And let's see, I talked a little bit about cameras, and thermal cameras the technology certainly exists with cameras. The challenge is they're extremely expensive compared to a detector, and they don't tell you what kind of bat you're looking at. So I'm aware of a few studies now that will be field testing thermal cameras in some capacity offshore as the turbines are built. But the other challenge offshore is there's nowhere to put your camera other than on the turbine itself, and that can make it challenging to see the full extent of the rotor. So again, this is the kind of thing I think it'll be easier to prove and test the technology at a terrestrial wind farm. Oh, and then a question from my mother, actually. Hello. Is it possible that bats can hear better than our detectors can hear? Undoubtedly. This is, again, where our bat detector is a very coarse instrument in terms of understanding what's happening, in terms of bats' ability to use echolocation. There's some phenomenal work that's been done with arrays of detectors that can show that bats can eavesdrop on each other and actually use another bat, can listen in on its echolocation, and then in the last minute swoop in and steal prey from in front of a bat. So it's certainly, I think it's absolute that bats can hear more, and that's sort of the thinking behind these deterrents, is if you can somehow either make the sound so repellent that bats will leave the area, or somehow communicate to them that this is a risk. But again, we don't know enough about how bats use echolocation in that way it's not an obvious, we don't have the obvious answer yet, but that's part of the reason there's so much interest in that, is it seems that there has to be some way of tapping into that behavioral response. And then a couple questions here on the detectability of detectors offshore and onshore. I think so. A big challenge with acoustics is that when air is humid, the ultrasonic signals don't travel as well through the air. That may, of course, make the bat echolocate more loudly. We don't know how that works, but it's certainly, if it's foggy, it's harder to hear things with acoustic detectors, and it's often foggy offshore. So that may be part of it, but overall, I don't have any reason to suspect that acoustic detectors wouldn't work in a similar way to how they work onshore. Again, if the range of, if the air, if the humidity level is changing the ability of ultrasound to travel through the air, I think it's pretty likely that the bat is able to adjust something about its echolocation to account for that. But again, that's getting beyond certainly what I know at this point. And then maybe I have time for one more here. is there a plan for mitigation plan or bank set up in place if and when myotis are hit? What's the plan? So myotis species, again, these include several federally endangered bats, including the Indiana bat and several others. The northern long-eared bat and the little brown bat is actually a candidate for federal listing. These are the species that have been most hard hit by white nose, are the northern long-eared and little brown bat, which before white nose were among the most common. So when federally listed species are killed, there's a series of regulations that are triggered. And there's a number of mitigation plans and actions that wind companies in particular follow when that happens. So again, those would function essentially in the same way, offshore as onshore. The big kicker, of course, is offshore. It's much, much harder to document any of this. So you can't do the typical surveys, carcass-based surveys that you do on land. So I think it's unrealistic that there would be, it's very unlikely that we would ever document a myotis fatality by species. Even if we have a video of a bat collision, it would be hard to tell, impossible to tell that it's one species of myotis or another. So I think there's probably, there's some basic questions we've got to figure out before we move to mitigation, I think, for offshore and even minimization. I think there would have to be relatively strong evidence that fatality rates are reaching the level to warrant minimization offshore. Again, we'll know a lot. We have an immense amount of information on fatality rates and the variation, the regional variation in those from terrestrial projects. And curtailment isn't generally a requirement in most regions. That's starting to change. But what I think would be possible long-term, whether there's a regulatory framework for this, is to look at where the fatality rates are highest geographically across the country, including possibly offshore if we can measure it, and really focus most of our efforts on the regions where the fatality rates are highest. I think that's a way of optimizing, the benefit to bats while still being able to generate as much, power as possible from these turbines. But it's something that I think, right now the regulatory structure isn't set up to do that very well. And so it's my hope that with data sets like these, we can provide some of the information on where the problem is greatest, and then start there to, because ultimately it doesn't do much good to turn turbines off if there aren't any bats flying around at that time. And so I think we can fill in the gaps there and make a lot more judicious use, I guess would be the way of saying it, of when to apply these measures. But it's fortunate that there are methods available that can turn a high risk, quote unquote, project from a bat's perspective into one that's essentially compatible with bats being able to continue to use the airspace while also being able to generate power, where as long as they're not happening at the exact same time.
All right, Trevor, we did have one more little fun question for you here. Someone is wondering what your favorite bat species is.
Boy, that's tricky. I mean, if I'm confining myself to ones that I've either seen or listened to, I think I kind of like hoary bats. They're I mean, they're kind of big and interesting looking, but there's so much about them that's just kind of fascinating and so little known about them. But they're ones that, it's what I'm amazed by is essentially anywhere you put a bat detector, whether it's on an offshore lighthouse or a boat, a buoy, the top of a tree, almost without fail, these same species, silver-haired bats, hoary bats, eastern red bats, will show up there at some point. And I think it's particularly fascinating knowing that we're only recording a tiny little airspace. And all of this, the primary issue with understanding what we should do and how much of a concern or not, a given level of fatality is we really don't know how many of these bats there are. And so I think it's that the amount that we don't know is partly why it's so interesting to work in this field. So I guess I'd give my vote for hoary bats.